Marhaba, shalom and welcome to the exciting podcast Israel and Palestine Unpacked that is dedicated to exploring the complexities of the ongoing political situation between Palestinians and Israelis. Throughout this podcast, we will explore unresolved issues, the human cost and the diverse experiences and perspectives of those directly affected. These discussions demand sensitivity as the emotional weight of the topic cannot be overlooked. So far, we have focused primarily on the personal stories of individuals, their experiences, struggles and views, which provide valuable insights into how lived experiences shape perceptions. Moving forward, in the near future, I aim to engage with academics, historians, journalists and writers who have examined different dimensions of this complex political landscape. Additionally, we will highlight the significant contributions of peace organizations, both locally and globally, whose work fosters understanding and offers paths towards reconciliation. This podcast approaches the subject from an academic perspective, striving to unpack and better understand the issues at hand. I am not a journalist by trade, and my interviewing skills are continually developing. With each conversation, I aim to grow through self-awareness and constructive feedback. While I may occasionally miss opportunities to further explore claims or subjects, I view these moments as steps in a learning journey that I hope will make each episode more insightful. Finally, it is important to emphasize that all views expressed are those of the interviewees alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of this podcast. Before Christmas, I initially stated that today we would be hearing from Paula, an Israeli, and Hani, a Palestinian. However, I have decided to make a change to the schedule and we will hear from both interviewees in the near future. Instead, in this episode we are speaking with Galit, an Israeli-American, and Seema, a Palestinian-American, who have both lived in the US for decades, but who remain deeply connected to their roots in different ways, such as through families, friends, and the cultural ties that shape their lives. I do hope that you find this episode of Israel and Palestine Unpacked informative, and if you would like to receive more content, you are welcome to subscribe and join us as we journey to gain insightful perspectives and knowledge together. In our first interview, we speak with Galit, an Israeli-American with dual citizenship. She was born to a mother who was a Holocaust refugee and a father, a native Israeli, born during the later years of the British Mandate for Palestine. Galit has lived in both Israel and the US and holds degrees from Columbia and Harvard universities, where she studied computer science and math education respectively. She is married and has 6 children, ranging in age from 14 to 31. In our interview, we discuss various topics, including the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, navigating dual identities, her thoughts on the Oslo Accords, and the prospects for peace. But before diving into these subjects, we begin by exploring her family history and early years.
My mother was a refugee from Poland. Her family narrowly escaped the Holocaust, and they came to Israel in 1950. My father was born under the British Mandate, so he was Israeli from the moment there was a state of Israel. After they got married, they came to the United States, and my brother and I were born in the United States, so we have dual citizenship from birth. After that, my family lived in Israel from 1970 to 1978. So my early childhood was Israeli. My first language was Hebrew. My identity, as I understood it, was Israeli. And then my family did move back to the United States, and I've lived in the United States basically ever since then.
Where did you live when you lived there?
I lived in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. I went to a secular Israeli school. I had a general education of Israeli Jewish culture. It didn't have the kind of depth that you learn in high school or college, but it was just the basic kind of identification with your culture that you learn in any country, of understanding where you come from and a general pride in who you are.
What was life like in Israel in the 1970s?
I did live in Israel. I was 4 years old during the Yom Kippur War. I don't remember the war specifically. I was definitely pretty sheltered from that, but I do know that in the years when I was living there, it was common for kids to collect bullet casings that you could just find in the street that were left over from the war. And so, we didn't think too much about how they got there. It was just like, oh, cool. Here, I'll add this to my collection. It was just part of life. Likewise, part of life was that we had bomb shelter drills. Just like in the United States, we had fire drills. We didn't particularly expect fires in school, but we had the drills. Likewise, we didn't usually expect to have bombs falling on us, but we had the drills. So that was a part of the landscape of the life that we were just took for as part of what is.
So what was the experience for your parents like? The 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, or did your parents share much about these things with you as you got older?
They didn't talk much about the history. I did learn some stuff about their experiences after they passed away, reading through their letters. They had letters and such that they wrote in real time. Because when they were living in the United States, they would write letters to their parents. So I can see through the correspondence how they were experiencing those things. But mostly I just saw through their attitudes about current events, how they felt about things. Now, we were talking before we started the interview about the Camp David Accords. Those are going on right around the time that we came back to the United States. And I was about 9 years old at the time, which is an age when you start to be more aware of the world around you. And the fact that this was a big transition in my life also meant that I was more aware of changes and differences. I was experiencing anti-Semitism when we came to the United States, instead of just hearing about it as other people's experiences. It was something that actually happened to me. So I was more aware of things, and seeing the Camp David Accords on the news at that formative age colored my views on the possibility of peace and set me up to have a fundamental sense of hope that peace is possible. And as I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking how the sense of hope has gone up and down. We've had times of a lot of hope and times of disappointment and even despair, that whether peace is ever actually possible. And I think right now, with everything that's going on, we are definitely at a low point. But coming from being 55 years old, I just can't help but feel that we will get past this and we will have a time of hope again. I don't think it's possible to live without having hope.
You're born in New York to Israeli parents. You've had the opportunity of living in Israel as well as in the US. How do you navigate your identity? How do you balance your Israeli heritage and that of your American upbringing? How do you view the world through that lens?
When I was growing up in New York after age 9, my family was never religious. So my experience of what it meant to be Jewish was my Israeli identity, Israeli culture, the Hebrew language, being part of the Jewish people as opposed to the Jewish religion specifically. And I actually became somewhat more observant as an adult, like after I had kids, but I'm not what anybody would call religious right now either. I'm still in the spectrum of Jewish people, closer to the secular end of things. But it is important for me to be part of community. So for most of my adult life, I have kept as part of a Jewish community in the United States, kept up with goings on in Israel. I have visited Israel every couple of years. All my extended family is there. So the most difficult part of the dual identity is that whenever I am in the United States, I feel like there's a draw to be in Israel. And when I'm in Israel, I know that there's so much of my life that's in the United States. I have adult children now who have their lives here. I can't just leave all of that. So it's always a compromise.
You have had parents who have had significant life experiences in the shape of conflict and trauma. How, for you, have these experiences shaped your own perspectives?
I was mostly sheltered from my parents' trauma. I think a lot of people who live through trauma and are able to get out of it want to give their children a better life where they don't have to deal with it. So a lot of that trauma is in the sense that what I said earlier about hope, wanting to have a better world where we don't have to have that kind of trauma again.
You have family in Israel. How has the ongoing fighting impacted them?
I have a first cousin whose oldest son is in the reserves in an elite unit, and they worry about him. And obviously we worry about him and we pray for him. And when there have been, anytime we hear about the rocket attacks or the missile attacks, I call them and I make sure everybody's okay.
You live in the US and they are in Israel. How do their opinions differ from yours?
They're more optimistic than me. They have lived through all of this stuff. There's a tendency to see conflict from afar as bigger than when you're living through it, because when you're living through it, it's just your life and you have ways of navigating the conflict that become normalized for you. Whereas when you look at the conflict from outside, it seems bigger. So when I call them and say, hey, how are you doing with what I'm hearing on the news? They're like, we just, life is fine. We went to the bomb shelters last night for 2 hours and then it was all over. And we went back to go to the mall. We did what we need to do.
On the idea of optimism, you stated that they are more optimistic than you. Do you think that there is the possibility for a just and peaceful outcome?
Not in the short term. Like I said, I have hope and optimism that we will have a period of hope again in the future where there will be possibility of that. I think that right now there are extremists on both sides that have vested interests in sabotaging all of the efforts of the good people. And there are good people on both sides, and there's a lot of good work being done. And some of the other people that you interviewed talked about those efforts, and I could talk about some of those from my life. And a lot of people like to argue, are there more people, or are there more good people on this side or that side? Are there more people who sabotage things on one side or the other side? And I feel like it really doesn't matter because there are enough of those on both sides that the good stuff doesn't get a chance to make progress. And I'm hoping that that will change one day somehow. In 2002, I was doing my master's in education at Harvard. And one of the classes that I took was religion and conflict. And the class was mostly focused on domestic issues and how religion can be used with urban conflicts and things like that. But I took that as an opportunity, and I to plan a trip to Israel that winter and create dialogue with people who are working on Jewish-Arab dialogue and cooperation. And I did some research. I sought out some contacts. I lined up some interviews. And when I came to Israel and I talked with my aunts and uncles and told them about it, every single person I talked with said, "Why didn't you tell me this? Here, I know somebody for you to talk with. Here, let me put you in touch." So like I have an aunt who was a teacher, and she put me in touch with a teacher who worked in cooperative education for Jewish and Arab children. I have an uncle who put me in touch with some businessmen who worked with Palestinians in the West Bank for economic development. We talked with people about water resource cooperation, and it was just like, and these are the conservative members of my family. Like I have the whole other side of my family that's more liberal, and these are the conservative ones, and every single one of them knew somebody who was involved in Jewish-Arab cooperation. And that just blew me away, that I did not expect that. And that was a time of hope.
And you were saying that was in 2002 during the Palestinian Intifada, the second Intifada. Yeah. How do you think that is now? Is there still that same vibrancy on a grassroots level?
I know that there are still a lot of cooperative efforts. One of the things that I saw as being hopeful that I now think of as a disappointment was the Oslo Accords. I feel were a process that was imposed from without a real sensitivity to the people actually impacted, and a lot of the elements of the Oslo Accords ended up creating much, much bigger problems. A lot of what people see as apartheid in the West Bank was put in motion by things that started from the Oslo Accords. That's the way I see it. An example of that is a few years before that, in 1996, I was visiting family with my oldest child, who was a baby at the time. And I was driving from one city to another and accidentally took the wrong turn and drove into the West Bank and went into a gas station to ask for directions and thought everything was in Arabic. And that was my first clue. There were no checkpoints. There was no clear line. I'm sure it was perceived differently to a Palestinian at the time. It was still a military occupation, but I know that there was a lot more interaction between the communities before you had walls and barriers between the Arab and Jewish areas. And I know that there was a good motivation for creating the A, B, and C areas, but the end result is that people interacted a lot less, which meant that a lot of the cooperation that was possible was not possible anymore, or much harder. I think that in contrast, what we said earlier about the Camp David Accords, because that was coming organically from within when Sadat said, "I'm going to come to Jerusalem," and the Israeli government said, "We're going to make that possible. We're going to make sure we have the security in place," and they made it happen. And I think that when you have the kind of courageous initiative from leadership, then these things can happen. And right now, we don't have courageous leadership on either side. So, and I know that in Israel, a lot of people really hate the current leadership. And they hated the current leadership before the conflict. And we have to see what will happen 2, 3, 5 years down the road. Will we have courageous leadership on our side and on the other side? And if we do, then anything is possible.
You're listening to Israel and Palestine Unpacked with me, your host, Porrick. If you have any comments, questions or feedback, please feel free to contact me at Israel-Palestine-Unpacked@gmail.com. Or alternatively, you can connect via our Facebook page or X account. All contact information can be found below in the description. In our second interview, we speak with Seema, a Palestinian-American born in Amman, Jordan, and a descendant of the Dajani family, a prominent Jerusalemite lineage with over 5 centuries of history in the land. Political unrest in Mandate Palestine forced her family to resettle in Amman, where she was born. After the Six-Day War in 1967, they immigrated to the United States in search of new opportunities. In the US, Seema embraced her Middle Eastern heritage and underwent a faith conversion to Christianity, deepening her understanding of the Holy Land and its people. She is now the co-founder of a German Palestinian Jewish dialogue group dedicated to fostering reconciliation through faith. In this interview, we explore how Seema remains connected to her Palestinian roots, navigates her Arab American identity, and approaches the complexities of Israel and Palestine. We begin with her sharing the history of the Dajani family.
As far as I was told, we originated from Arabia, immigrated to Spain for about 100 years. There is a plaque that talks about Hajj Yusuf Dajani in Alhambra. And then the family moved to Morocco for another 100 years. So the story goes, 4 ships left Morocco to go to Jerusalem to ward off the Crusaders. Now, I don't have documentation for that time period, but we do have documentation for 500 years as being the caretakers of King David's citadel, and that we had the keys of the upper room and gave it to the Franciscans in 1474.
Okay, so just for viewers, what do you mean by the upper room, just in case anybody's not clear on what that means?
The upper room where Jesus had the disciples and they had the Passover dinner.
I think I read that one of the Dajanis who came from Morocco had a dream one night of Nabi Dawood, which is the Prophet David in Islam, about how he was requesting help from this member of your family centuries ago. And that was the inspiration because he was a Sufi. He was a Sufi who felt led then by the Prophet David within the Islamic tradition to come to Jerusalem to rescue the tomb of David, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what I read actually in the article that you sent to me, which I can link underneath.
I think they said that the Christian monks were not taking care of the King David, so he was going to try to do that. You find also that even in the Holy Sepulchre Church, the 4 different Christian denominations, they don't agree among themselves, so they usually will hire a Muslim person to come and open the doors and close the doors of the church and be basically the custodian.
So what important roles, from your understanding, did the Dajani family hold in Jerusalem?
You know, they were a prominent family, one of the 3 largest families in Jerusalem. They became spiritual leaders. They were judges, lawyers, administrators, many doctors, teachers, and business people. I have 2 grandfathers that are businessmen.
Okay, very interesting. And what important role then did they play within the Ottoman Empire and within the British Mandate period? Are you familiar with that particular history?
The British Mandate period, I don't know that much about that time period, other than that I heard that since the family was not engaged in politics so much, that we were at odds with the Husseini family. And one of the Dajani members wanted to declare Palestine as a state, but apparently was assassinated by one of the other Palestinian families. So that was the tension that was happening at that time.
Okay. There was I believe there was a lot of internal issues within Palestinian politics, with the Husseinis on one side and the Nashashabis and the Dajanis on the other side, and they both had different approaches towards the British mandatory powers, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. I do have a Jewish friend who, when he met me, told me that if the Dajani family was in charge, that they would have had peace with the Jews a long time ago. We were a lot more diplomatic. We got along with the Jewish community. We were not militant thinking, and violence was not part of our activities.
Did the Dajani family have any connections with any of the Zionist leaders at the time, from during the period of the late Ottoman Empire, right through the Mandate period? Can you think of any examples?
You know what? I did understand from a book that was written. A Jewish friend of mine conferred that there were Dajani family members that were helping the Stern Gang, which was underground at the time, before 1948, before Israel became a nation. So they were different family members engaged in different activities. I know that our family was affected by the British. I know that my grandfather ended up in jail because he was organizing groups of people to come against the British occupation, because that's what they were sensing at the time. They were trying to get delivered from the British occupation. So I think they were more involved in that.
The period of the British Mandate was in some ways very destabilizing socially and politically. In 1948, there was the Palestinian Nakba. What impact did the Nakba have on the Dajani family within Jerusalem?
Grandfather had 5 businesses in East Jerusalem. And, as the war or rumors of the war coming, people usually will leave temporarily their homes to go to hide for safety reasons. And so he went to Amman, Jordan, but never ended up coming back to Jerusalem. My mom's side of the family, her dad, also a businessman, had moved out of Palestine and went into Amman, Jordan, and started businesses there before the war. So I never thought of my family as a refugee family, maybe because we weren't forced to walk on the bridge into Jordan. But I realized that my dad's side of the family, that was not his intent, to leave his 5 businesses and to immigrate to another country. And the influence that had on my father is he was in the United States from 1947 to 52. So when he goes back, he was supposed to come to America to study as a doctor, to go back and start a hospital in East Jerusalem, like the hospital that was in Jaffa, because that doctor was a friend of his dad, and he was supposed to come back to Jerusalem, but of course never did. And I think he never forgot that. That affected him for the rest of his life.
But you yourself were born in Amman, Jordan, isn't that correct?
Correct. So when my dad left the United States after his education, went to Jordan, married his 3rd cousin, fell in love and married his 3rd cousin, had us children. Me and my sister, he came back for his fellowship and to the United States when I was 4 years old, and then went back to Jordan and worked in the laboratory. And it was at that time in 1967, before the 6-Day War, we were contemplating immigrating for good to the United States.
So that's how you came to grow up in the US. What age were you when you left Jordan to go to the United States of America?
How old was I?
Yeah.
I was 9 years old. I do remember our time in Amman, Jordan during the 6-Day War. I was a child, and that was a scary moment for me. But that's when we came in the summer of 1967. And I started fourth grade here in the United States.
You have an interesting and a unique perspective. How have you yourself, Seema, stayed connected to your Palestinian roots?
I feel like physically I'm here in the United States, but my heart never left the Middle East. So as I grew up, my father sharing about the stories of his life in Jerusalem and the family and all that he did, that became a part of who I was. And so as I grew up and learned more about the crisis that happened in 1948, I decided to stay engaged and learn more and more about what happened. And then after becoming a Christian, I got involved more because of the spiritual relationship. And that's what kept me connected. So I feel like I'm a mixed breed. I have the Middle Eastern culture and the American culture, and I've taken the best of both worlds. And that's who I am today. So it is kind of confusing because sometimes I forget, is this coming from my Middle Eastern side or is this coming from my American side?
But it's interesting because that's a very unique set of perspectives that you have that people in the West don't have. They have a very Western view. They've grown up in a Western society, etc., etc. You have balanced both an Arab mindset, and because you grew up there during your formative years, but you've also, in a sense, as you said, you've grown up in America, but you've taken the best of both sides. Are the best of both, in a sense, worldviews as such. It's allowed you to be able to broaden your horizons. How has living in the US, particularly in line with your Arab mentality and your Western mentality, how has it helped to influence your views of the ongoing conflict in Jerusalem, in the area as large in Israel and Palestine, how and further afield?
I feel like it's given me more of a balance, but at the same time, I feel I get very misunderstood because I am coming from a Middle Eastern perspective. And I realize if I'm looking at my faith, Jesus is Jewish, he's Middle Eastern. So I think more like him, he thinks more like me. And yet I live in the West, and when I share my faith, when I share my background, when I share my upbringing, it's almost like a foreign language to Americans. So it makes it very difficult to be accepted. Many people will say, well, that's an interesting perspective. And it's like, yes, but does that mean that it's a wrong perspective, or is that perspective accepted? So I feel like it can be very conflicting. I feel at the same time, I might be more in tune to what the reality is. And so I get different responses as to my comments, my attitudes, my perspectives on culture, politics, the people. And maybe that's what makes me more sensitive to the Arabs and the Middle Eastern people, because I come from Muslim background. I am Arabic. I know that we're not militant, we're not terrorists, but yet that's what we're labeled as in the media in the United States. So it can be very painful as immigrants coming into America when we hear negative comments about our culture, our people group. We're labeled as enemies of Jews. I even had one coworker in the middle of my work walk up to me and say, "Why do you hate Jews?" She knows nothing about me other than my background. We've never had a conversation. We've never sat down and talked. And yet she made this big assumption, not knowing I have spent 8 years sitting in a room in a dialogue with Jewish people in Berkeley. And so I get faced with a lot of stereotyping and slanders and comments that are not appropriate because of lack of knowledge. And basically, that's what drives me to learn more and more and learn about the crisis, learn about the Jewish community, learn about what they believe, what are their fears. At the same time, learning more about my own people group, what's going on with them, what are their fears, what are their concerns, what are their hopes, desires. And I find that we're both the same, because really we're cousins to the Jewish people. So the bottom line, I told them, we're cousins and we're having a family feud.
Yeah. Have you had the opportunity to return to Jerusalem, to return to the land of Israel and Palestine? And if so, how has your experience been living as a Palestinian-American outside of the land?
When I started going to church, it took me about 5 years before I got to the place where I could forgive. I had to learn to forgive myself, my family, all the hurts and pains on a personal level. But then when it came to forgiving Israel for what wrong they have committed against the Palestinians, I feel that was the hardest. But when I was able to do that, I agreed to go in one of those tour buses and tour Israel as a tourist, which I said I would never do to my own people. So in 1995, I went for the first time as an adult to Israel and to visit Jerusalem, and to try to get connected also with family members or the Jewish community, talk to rabbis. And so that's what I did after the tour. I connected with different people. I met Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem and in Jerusalem. And I met rabbis and tried to get a better understanding of what's happening politically and what's happening, on the ground in that region. Over the years, I have gone now 10 times in the last about 20, 25 years. I have volunteered two times as a nurse. I've done biblical studies, 5 months in Jerusalem. And each time I learn more and more about what's happening there. So I've become involved more and more in reconciliation. So I feel like as a believer in the Lord, that love is what expresses Christians, but the word reconciliation comes right afterwards. And so I've been more involved in taking trips to Israel for my church. I've taken 3 trips, organized and led trips. And we visit both the Jewish community and the Palestinian community, so that people can have a balanced view and hear the pain and suffering that's happening on both sides, and hear the good news that's happening on both sides.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to express my deepest gratitude to our incredible guests, Galit and Seema, for their openness and willingness to share their personal views, experiences, and rich stories. Their unique perspectives have given us valuable insights into the complexities of identity, heritage, and the challenges of navigating the Israeli-Palestinian landscape. Looking ahead to our next episode, we'll be speaking with Dalia, a Palestinian lady from Gaza currently living in Cairo, and Kemi, a British Israeli lady living in Israel. Both bring deeply personal and compelling narratives that will add new dimensions to our ongoing exploration of this multifaceted conflict. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Your engagement means the world to us. If you have thoughts, feedback, or questions, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out via email at Israeli-Palestinian-Unpacked@gmail.com or connect with us through our Facebook page. All the contact details are included in the description below. Finally, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss future episodes. I hope you'll join me next time on Israel and Palestine Unpacked, where we continue to delve into the stories, voices, and lived experiences that define this region.